Blood stained the Arizona sand as Tarek Voss stood over 3 dead men, his knife still dripping. The woman behind him shouldn't be alive. Yet there she stood, trembling but defiant, a child clutched to her chest. He'd heard her screams from a mile away, followed the gunfire expecting soldiers or raiders. Instead, he found something far more dangerous. A choice. Walk away and let the frontier swallow her whole, or break every rule he'd lived by for 15 years. The sun was setting. More would come. And for the first time in his life, the feared Apache warrior hesitated. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The desert had a way of revealing truth. It stripped away pretense, comfort, and lies until only the essential remained: survival or death. Tarek Voss had learned this lesson before he could speak, before he understood that the world was divided between those who took and those who were taken from. The Arizona Territory in 1871 was a land of brutal arithmetic. You calculated your odds every morning and adjusted your expectations by nightfall. He moved through the canyon like smoke, his moccasins silent against the red rock. 15 years of warfare had taught him to read the land the way other men read books. The angle of shadows told him the time within minutes. The scattered pebbles near the wash indicated a rider had passed within the hour, moving fast, heading east. The circling vultures 3 miles north meant something was dying or already dead. Tarek carried little: a rifle he'd taken from a cavalry sergeant who no longer needed it, a knife his grandfather had made before the treaties were broken, and a leather pouch containing jerky, ammunition, and a small tin cup. Traveling light meant traveling fast, and speed was the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the dust. He was 32, though the desert had aged him beyond his years. His face was carved from hard angles, his eyes dark and unreadable. Scars crossed his shoulders and back, some from combat, others from rituals that marked him as a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache. His hair hung long and loose, black as obsidian, occasionally caught by the wind that swept through the canyons. Most settlers called him a ghost story. Those who'd seen him rarely lived to provide details. The cavalry had a bounty posted, $500 for Tarek Voss, dead or alive, wanted for raids on supply lines, attacks on patrols, and the burning of a trading post that had been selling poisoned whiskey to his people. He wore their accusations like armor. Tarek trusted 3 things: his weapons, his instincts, and the certainty that attachment was a luxury that got good men killed. He'd watched his father die defending a village that no longer existed. He'd seen warriors fall because they hesitated, because they'd started families, because they'd allowed themselves to believe that something beyond survival mattered. Love was a weakness. Community was a target. The only law that held true was the one written in blood: stay alone, stay alive. The gunfire started just after noon. It came from the east, rapid and panicked. The sound of revolvers, not rifles. Civilian weapons, not military. Tarek's first instinct was to ignore it. People killed each other constantly out here. Prospectors fighting over claims, ranchers settling disputes, outlaws dividing spoils. None of it concerned him, but something about the pattern bothered him. The shots were defensive, scattered, desperate, and beneath them, barely audible over the wind, he heard something else: a woman's scream. Tarek stopped walking. The logical choice was clear: keep moving, let whatever was happening resolve itself without him. He'd survived this long by refusing to involve himself in others' catastrophes. The frontier was full of tragedies, and each one was a trap waiting to close around anyone foolish enough to intervene, yet he found himself turning east toward the sound. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. Information had value. Knowing who was fighting and why could be useful. He'd observe from a distance, gather intelligence, and continue on his way. That was all. The gunfire had stopped by the time he reached the ridge overlooking the ambush site. Below, in a shallow depression between 2 rocky outcroppings, lay the wreckage of a small wagon train. 2 covered wagons, both overturned, their canvas torn and burning. Bodies littered the ground, some face down in the dirt, others sprawled at unnatural angles. Tarek counted quickly: 5 men, all dead or dying. The attackers had already departed, their horse tracks heading northwest. Raiders, most likely. Probably the same group that had hit a stagecoach 2 weeks prior. They traveled fast, hit hard, and disappeared into the Superstition Mountains before any pursuit could organize. He was about to withdraw when he saw movement near the second wagon. A woman emerged from behind the overturned vehicle, clutching a rifle she clearly didn't know how to use. Her dress was torn and dusty, her face smudged with ash and blood. Dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it, falling in wild tangles around her shoulders. And in her other arm, pressed against her chest, was a child. A boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, silent and wide-eyed with terror. Tarek went still, his tactical mind immediately cataloging the situation. The woman was injured. He could see blood on her left sleeve. The rifle's hammer wasn't cocked. She was scanning the horizon with the desperation of someone who knew death was close but refused to accept it. She should have been dead already. The raiders must have assumed she was, buried under the wreckage or hiding somewhere they didn't bother to check. Sloppy. They'd regret that when they realized they'd left a witness, or they'd be back to finish the job. Tarek watched her stumble toward one of the bodies, a man in his 40s, probably her husband. She knelt beside him, her face crumpling, and even from this distance, Tarek could see the grief that racked her frame. The child whimpered. The woman pulled him closer, whispering something Tarek couldn't hear. This wasn't his problem. She was a settler, probably headed to one of the new territories opening up, chasing the same foolish dream that had brought thousands of others to die in this unforgiving land. Her tragedy was one of countless others. Intervening would accomplish nothing except putting a target on his own back. He should leave. Now. But he didn't move. The woman stood, turning slowly in a circle, the rifle shaking in her grip. She was looking for help that wouldn't come. The nearest settlement was 2 days' ride, and she was on foot, injured, and carrying a child. Even if she knew which direction to walk, which she clearly didn't, the desert would kill her long before she reached anything resembling safety. Tarek's jaw tightened. He'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of detachment, of moving through the world without leaving marks or forming bonds. This woman and her child were about to become another anonymous tragedy, 2 more bodies for the vultures, 2 more forgotten casualties of a brutal land. That should have been the end of it. Instead, against every instinct that had kept him alive, against every rule he'd forged in blood and loss, Tarek Voss began moving down the ridge. Batidas. Lillian Cross heard the footsteps before she saw him. She spun, raising the rifle with trembling arms, her finger finding the trigger even though she'd never fired a gun in her life. The man who emerged from behind the rocks moved like water, fluid and silent. And when her eyes finally focused on him, every terrified instinct screamed at her to run. He was Apache. She knew it instantly. The traditional clothing, the long black hair, the way he carried himself with absolute confidence in this hostile landscape. And she knew what that meant. The stories she'd heard, the warnings from other settlers, the newspaper accounts of raids and massacres, all of it crystallized into pure animal terror. "Stay back!" Her voice cracked, the rifle wavering. "I'll shoot!" The man stopped, but not from fear. His dark eyes assessed her with the cold efficiency of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort. He said nothing, just stood there, completely still, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Behind her, Michael, her nephew, her responsibility, the only family she had left, began to cry. "Please," Lillian heard herself say, hating the desperation in her voice. "Please, we haven't done anything. We're just trying to get to California. Please don't. You're injured." His English was perfect, unaccented, which somehow made him more terrifying. "Your arm." Lillian glanced down. Blood had soaked through her sleeve from elbow to wrist, though she couldn't remember when it had happened. The entire attack was a blur. The thunder of hooves, the screaming, Thomas pushing her behind the wagon before the bullet hit him, Michael's terrified face as she dragged him into the crawl space beneath the overturned vehicle. "It's nothing," she lied. "It will be infected by tomorrow." The man's gaze shifted to the bodies scattered around them. "Your people?" The word caught in her throat. "Yes. The raiders went northwest. They'll realize they missed you. They'll come back." He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone might comment on approaching weather. Probably before nightfall. Terror spiked through Lillian's chest. "Then we'll hide. Where?" The man gestured at the open terrain. This land has no mercy for the unprepared. You're bleeding, you have no water, no horse, no real weapon. His eyes dropped to the rifle. That's not even loaded correctly. Lillian looked down and realized with horror that he was right. She could see the cylinder wasn't properly aligned. She'd grabbed it from Thomas's body without knowing how to check it. "Why are you telling me this?" she demanded, fresh tears burning her eyes. "If you're going to kill us, just—" "I'm not going to kill you." The simplicity of the statement made her pause. The man shifted his rifle to his other hand, a casual movement that somehow conveyed he could kill her easily if he chose to, making the choice not to all the more significant. "You have two options," he continued. "Stay here and die, or come with me." Lillian stared at him. "Come with you? I don't even know who you are." "Tarek Voss." He said it like it should mean something. "And you're out of time to negotiate, Miss Lillian Cross." She straightened her spine despite the terror coursing through her veins. "And that's Michael. He's 5. Tarek's gaze flicked to the boy, something unreadable crossing his face before the mask of indifference returned. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then prove it. We move now, or you stay here and become food for scavengers." It was the cruelty of the statement that somehow convinced her he was telling the truth. A man planning to harm them wouldn't have wasted time with warnings or options. He would have simply acted. Lillian looked at the bodies. Thomas, who'd been kind to her after her sister died, who'd promised to get them safely to California where they could start over. Margaret, who'd told stories around the campfire. The Harrison brothers, young and optimistic, certain they'd strike gold and return home rich. All dead. All gone. And she was being offered a choice between certain death and possible survival by a man who should have been her enemy. "All right," she whispered, pulling Michael closer. "We'll come." Tarek nodded once, already turning away. "Keep up. I won't slow down for you." They walked for hours in silence. Tarek set a brutal pace, moving through terrain that seemed impossible to traverse. Lillian followed, her injured arm throbbing with every step, Michael heavy in her arms despite his small size. The boy had stopped crying but remained silent, his face pressed against her shoulder. Twice, Lillian stumbled. Twice, Tarek continued walking without looking back, forcing her to push herself upright and hurry after him before he disappeared among the rocks. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Lillian's throat was raw with thirst, her legs shaking with exhaustion, but she refused to ask for rest. Some stubborn part of her, the same part that had made her raise that unloaded rifle against an Apache warrior, refused to show weakness. Finally, as the last light faded, Tarek stopped at the entrance to a narrow canyon. "Here." He gestured to a small cave carved into the rock face, barely large enough for 3 people. "We'll stay until dawn." Lillian practically collapsed inside, setting Michael down gently before her legs gave out completely. The boy immediately curled against her side, his small body trembling. Tarek remained at the entrance, his back to them, watching the desert with the vigilance of someone who never truly rested. "Why are you helping us?" Lillian finally asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't turn around. "I'm not helping you. I'm making a mistake." "Then why?" "Because sometimes the desert makes us do things that go against survival." His voice was flat, emotionless. "You should sleep. We leave before sunrise." "I don't even know where we're going." "Fort Bowie. 3 days northeast. They'll take you in, send you wherever you were heading." He paused. "Assuming we survive that long." Lillian wanted to ask more. Why Fort Bowie would take in an Apache, whether they were truly safe, what he meant by "assuming we survive." But exhaustion was pulling her under like a tide. Michael had already fallen asleep against her, his breathing soft and steady. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she opened them again, dawn light was streaming through the cave entrance, and Tarek was crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Time to move," he said quietly. Lillian sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Her arm had stopped bleeding, but the wound looked angry and swollen. Tarek noticed immediately. "Let me see." "It's fine." He grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but with unmistakable authority, and pushed her sleeve up. The gash ran from her elbow to her forearm, deep enough to need stitches she wouldn't get. Tarek reached into his pouch and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "This will hurt," he warned, then pressed a handful of crushed herbs directly into the wound. Lillian gasped, biting her lip to keep from crying out and waking Michael. The pain was immediate and intense, but Tarek held her arm steady, his grip firm as he bound the injury with strips of clean cloth. "What is that?" she managed through gritted teeth. "Medicine. It will stop infection." He finished wrapping the wound and released her arm. "You'll live." "Comforting," Lillian muttered, flexing her fingers carefully. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Tarek's eyes before disappearing. "We have a long walk ahead. Can the boy manage on his own?" Lillian looked at Michael, who was just waking up, his eyes puffy from exhaustion and tears. "He's strong. He can walk." "Good, because I can't carry both of you if trouble comes." They left the cave as the sun climbed above the horizon, transforming the desert into a blast furnace of heat and glare. Tarek led them through a maze of canyons and washes, always choosing paths that offered cover, always scanning the terrain with those dark, unreadable eyes. Michael walked between them, his small hand gripping Lillian's skirt. He hadn't spoken since the attack, and Lillian worried about the silence, about what horrors were playing behind those wide eyes. Around midday, Tarek raised his hand suddenly, stopping them both. "What?" Lillian began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. Silence. Then she heard it too. Horses, distant but approaching. Multiple riders. Tarek's expression went cold and flat. "Into the rocks, now!" They scrambled into a cluster of boulders just as the riders came into view. 5 men on horseback, heavily armed, scanning the desert with the methodical patience of hunters tracking prey. "The raiders," Lillian whispered, her heart hammering. "Quiet." Tarek's hand went to his knife. "Don't move. Don't breathe loud. If they find us, grab the boy and run north. Don't look back." "But do it!" The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, close enough that Lillian could hear them talking. "Can't have gone far, not on foot. Waste of time. She's probably dead already." "Boss wants no witnesses. You know the rule." They continued past, and Lillian felt her lungs burn as she realized she'd been holding her breath. Beside her, Michael had gone completely still, his small body pressed against hers. Tarek waited until the hoofbeats faded completely before moving. "They'll circle back," he said quietly. "We need to move faster." "We're going as fast as we can." "Then you'll have to go faster." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than cold assessment in his eyes. "I need you to understand something, Miss Cross. Those men will kill you slowly if they catch you. They'll make examples. So when I say move, you move. When I say run, you run. And when I say hide, you hide like your life depends on it, because it does." Lillian swallowed hard. "All right. Can you shoot?" "What?" Tarek pulled a revolver from his belt. A smaller weapon than his rifle, easier to handle. "Can you shoot this if you have to?" I've never..." "It's simple. Point at what you want to kill. Pull the trigger. Keep pulling until it stops moving." He pressed the weapon into her uninjured hand. 6 shots. Make them count." The gun felt impossibly heavy in her grip, cold and brutal and real. Lillian looked at Tarek, at this stranger who terrified her and was somehow keeping her alive, and nodded. "Good." He turned away. "Let's go." They traveled through the afternoon heat, and Lillian began to understand how completely unprepared she'd been for this land. Every step revealed her ignorance. She didn't know which plants held water, which rocks provided shade, which paths would lead to dead ends. The desert was a language she couldn't read, and Tarek spoke it fluently. He showed her how to find moisture in barrel cacti, how to recognize the signs of a nearby water source, how to walk in a way that minimized their tracks. He never asked if she was tired, never slowed his pace, but twice he stopped in patches of shade and let them rest without comment. Michael began to open up slightly during the second rest, pointing at a lizard sunning itself on a nearby rock. "Desert spiny," Tarek said, following the boy's gaze. "Fast. Good at hiding." Michael looked up at him with wide eyes, and something in Tarek's expression shifted. A crack in the armor, barely visible, gone almost before Lillian could register it. "You like animals?" Tarek asked, his voice softer than Lillian had heard it. Michael nodded. Then you'll survive out here. Animals know things people forget. They know when to fight and when to run, when to make noise and when to stay silent. He paused. What's your favorite animal? Horses, Michael whispered, his first words in 2 days. Good choice. Horses are smart, loyal. Tarek stood, offering his hand to pull Lillian up. But they need water like us. Let's go. As they walked, Lillian found herself studying the man who'd become their unlikely protector. Tarek moved with absolute confidence, every gesture precise and economical. He wasted nothing, not motion, not words, not energy. It was the discipline of someone who'd survived by eliminating everything unnecessary. How long have you lived out here? She asked. Too long. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Lillian bristled. I'm just trying to understand. Understanding won't keep you alive, Miss Cross. Following instructions will. My name is Lillian. Tarek glanced back at her. I know. You told me yesterday. Then use it. If we're going to spend 3 days together, the least you can do is use my name. For a moment, she thought he'd ignore her completely. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it. Fine. Lillian. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Like getting him to acknowledge she was a person, not just a burden he'd inexplicably chosen to carry. That night, they camped in another cave, this one larger and deeper. Tarek built a small fire using dry mesquite wood that produced almost no smoke, and for the first time since the attack, Lillian felt something approaching warmth. Michael fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's walking. Lillian sat across the fire from Tarek, watching him clean his weapons with methodical care. Why do they call you a ghost? She asked suddenly. His hands paused on the rifle barrel. Who told you that? I heard stories. Before. She swallowed. They said there was an Apache warrior who moved like smoke, who struck and vanished before anyone could respond. They called him the Ghost of the Sonoran. People tell a lot of stories. Are they true? Tarek looked at her across the flames, and in that moment, Lillian saw something ancient and terrible in his eyes, years of violence and survival, of choices that had carved away everything soft until only the essential remained. Some of them, he said finally. And the bounty? $500? $750 now, actually. Inflation. He said it without humor. Doesn't that scare you? Fear is a luxury. It requires believing you have something to lose. Lillian frowned. Everyone has something to lose. Do they? Tarek set the rifle aside. My family is dead. My tribe scattered or imprisoned. My land stolen and carved up by men who've never seen it before but claim it belongs to them now. What exactly am I supposed to be afraid of losing, Lillian? The way he said her name, flat and cold, somehow hurt more than if he'd shouted. Your life, she said quietly. My life ended a long time ago. I'm just still breathing. Lillian wanted to argue, to tell him that was the most depressing thing she'd ever heard, but exhaustion was pulling at her again. She lay down next to Michael, pulling him close for warmth. Tarek? She said into the darkness. What? Thank you for not leaving us. Silence stretched out, broken only by the crackling fire. Sleep, he finally said. Tomorrow will be harder. Oh, the third day began with rain. It came suddenly, without warning, a rare desert storm that turned the sky black and transformed the dry washes into raging torrents within minutes. Tarek hurried them up onto higher ground, moving with urgent purpose that made Lillian's heart race. Flash flood, he explained curtly, pointing to the canyon below where water was already surging past. Kills more people than heat does out here. They huddled under an overhang as the storm raged. Michael pressed between them, shivering despite the relative warmth. Tarek had given the boy his outer shirt, leaving himself in just a thin cotton undershirt that quickly soaked through. Lillian watched water stream down his arms, tracing the scars that covered his skin, some old and faded, others relatively recent. Each one told a story of survival, of violence endured and overcome. How did you get that one? She asked, pointing to a particularly nasty scar that ran from his shoulder to his ribcage. Cavalry saber. Fort Apache 3 years ago. And that one? Mountain lion, Long story. We have time. Tarek looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, to her surprise, he began to talk. The story unfolded in short, clipped sentences. How he'd been tracking a raiding party when a mountain lion had ambushed him from above. How he'd fought it off with just a knife. How he'd walked 12 miles with deep gashes across his back to reach a place where he could treat the wounds. I was alone, he said, staring out at the rain. I'm always alone. It's safer that way. Is it? Lillian challenged. Or is it just lonelier? Loneliness doesn't kill you. Attachment does. That's a terrible way to live. It's the only way I know. He shifted, his shoulder brushing against hers in the confined space. Your people, the ones who died, were they family? Lillian's throat tightened. Thomas was married to my sister. She died giving birth to Michael 2 years ago. Thomas promised he'd take care of us, get us to California where we could start fresh. She paused. He kept that promise until he couldn't. And the others? Friends? Good people who didn't deserve what happened to them. Tarek was quiet for a moment. No one deserves what happens to them out here. The desert doesn't care about deserving. It only cares about strength. Is that what you think? That only the strong survive? I don't think it. I know it. I've seen it proven 1,000 times. Lillian looked at Michael, at his small face peaceful in sleep, and felt anger surge through her. He's 5 years old, Tarek. He's not strong, but he deserves to survive. He deserves to grow up and have a life and not, her voice broke, not end up like you, thinking that being alone is the only way to stay alive. Something in Tarek's expression cracked, just for a second, just enough for Lillian to see the man beneath the armor. You're right, he said quietly. He deserves better. That's why I'm getting you to Fort Bowie. And then what? You disappear back into the desert and wait for the next bounty hunter to find you? Probably. That's insane. That's survival. The rain began to lighten, and Tarek stood, ending the conversation. We should move. The storm will cover our tracks, but it'll also slow us down. We need to make up time. They traveled through mud and puddles. The desert transformed into something alien and treacherous. Twice, Lillian slipped, and twice, Tarek's hand shot out to steady her, strong and sure and gone again, before she could thank him. By late afternoon, they'd reached a high ridge that offered a view of the surrounding territory. Tarek stopped suddenly, his body going tense. What is it? Lillian asked. Riders. East Ridge, about 2 miles out. His voice was tight. Military patrol. Isn't that good? They can help us. They'll kill me on sight and ask questions later. Tarek's hand went to his rifle. You and the boy. You'll be fine. But I can't get any closer. Lillian's heart sank. But you said Fort Bowie. Change of plans. There's a settlement about 8 miles south of here. Small, mostly farmers and families who mind their own business. You can make it if you follow the wash and keep the sun on your right shoulder. 8 miles? With a 5-year-old? You'll manage. You're stronger than you think. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt and pressed it into her hand. Jerky, some dried fruit, and enough money to buy supplies. Don't tell anyone you were traveling with me. Make up a story about the attack, about wandering alone. They'll take you in. Lillian stared at the pouch, then at Tarek, understanding flooding through her. You're leaving. I was always leaving. This just happened sooner than planned. No. The word came out harder than she intended. No, you don't get to just... We've spent 3 days together, you've kept us alive, and now you're just going to disappear? That's exactly what I'm going to do. Why? Lillian demanded, anger and something else, something she didn't want to name, surging through her. Because it's easier? Because attachment is weakness? Because the great Tarek Voss doesn't need anyone? His jaw tightened. Because those soldiers will put a bullet in me the moment they recognize me, and I won't let you and the boy get caught in that crossfire. Then we'll hide. We'll wait until they pass. They're looking for me, Lillian. That's not a standard patrol. That's a hunting party. They've been tracking me for weeks. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. I've made too many mistakes already. Helping you was one of them. Don't make me regret it by being stupid now. Stupid? Lillian's voice rose. You're trying to make this into something it's not. I'm not your friend. I'm not your protector. I'm a wanted man who made a bad decision and helped two people who should have died 3 days ago. That's all this is." The words hit like physical blows, and Lillian stepped back, her eyes burning. "Fine. Go. Run back to your desert and your loneliness and your precious survival. We'll be fine without you." "Good." He turned to leave, and Lillian grabbed his arm without thinking. "Wait." Tarek looked back, his expression carefully blank. "Why did you do it?" Lillian asked quietly. "If it was such a mistake, why did you help us at all?" For a long moment he didn't answer, then so softly she barely heard it. "I don't know." He pulled free from her grip and walked away, disappearing into the rocks with the same silent efficiency he demonstrated from the beginning. Lillian stood there, Michael's hand in hers, watching until he vanished completely. "Where did he go?" Michael asked, his small voice uncertain. Lillian swallowed the lump in her throat. "He had to leave, sweetheart, but he showed us how to get somewhere safe. Can you be brave a little longer?" Michael nodded, and Lillian forced herself to turn away, to start walking south, to focus on survival instead of the hollow ache in her chest. They walked for hours as the sun descended. Lillian followed Tarek's instructions precisely. Wash on the left, sun on the right shoulder, steady pace despite exhaustion. Her wounded arm throbbed, her legs screamed in protest, but she kept moving. Just before dusk, Michael tugged on her skirt. "Miss Lily? I see smoke." Lillian looked up and felt relief crash through her. In the distance, maybe a mile away, thin columns of smoke rose into the evening sky. Cook fires, civilization, they'd made it. She picked up Michael, ignoring her protesting muscles, and hurried toward the settlement. The buildings materialized out of the twilight, small adobe structures, a well, a handful of horses in a corral. People moved between the buildings, normal and alive and safe. A woman spotted them first, her eyes widening as she took in Lillian's torn dress and bloodied arm. "Lord have mercy, John, come quick!" Within minutes, they were surrounded by concerned faces, gentle hands guiding them toward the largest building. Questions came fast. Where had they come from? What had happened? Were they injured? And Lillian answered as best she could, sticking to Tarek's advice. She and Michael had been attacked, had wandered alone, had survived by luck and determination. No one questioned the story. Why would they? She was a woman alone with a child, clearly traumatized, clearly in need. They saw what they expected to see. An older woman named Martha took charge, leading them to a small room with a real bed and fresh water. She tended to Lillian's wound with practiced hands, making sympathetic noises at the angry red edges. "You're lucky this isn't worse," Martha said, applying fresh bandages. "Another day and you might have lost the arm." Lillian thought about Tarek's medicine, about the herbs he'd pressed into the wound that had probably saved her from exactly that fate. I was fortunate. Blessed, more like. The desert isn't kind to the unprepared. Martha finished the bandaging and patted Lillian's hand. "You rest now. We'll sort everything out in the morning." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in days, Michael asleep beside her, Lillian should have felt relief, safety, gratitude. Instead, she felt the absence like a physical wound. She told herself it was just trauma, just exhaustion making her emotional. In a few days, she'd move on. She'd get to California, start that new life she'd planned, and forget about the Apache warrior who'd appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. But when she closed her eyes, all she saw was Tarek walking away into the rocks, alone again, the way he'd always been, the way he'd convinced himself he needed to be. And for the first time since the attack, Lillian Cross allowed herself to cry. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she feared might have been possible if things had been different. If the world had been kinder, if attachment hadn't been seen as weakness, if a warrior forged by the frontier had allowed himself to believe that survival wasn't the only thing worth fighting for. 3 miles north, Tarek Voss sat on a ridge overlooking the settlement, watching smoke rise from its cook fires. He'd tracked Lillian and the boy all the way, staying just far enough back to remain unseen but close enough to intervene if necessary. The cavalry patrol had passed without incident. No raiders had circled back. They'd reached safety exactly as he'd planned. His job was done. He could leave now, disappear back into the desert, return to the life he understood. He should leave. But Tarek stayed on that ridge until full dark, watching the small buildings below, thinking about a woman who'd called him out on his loneliness and a boy who'd whispered his first words in days while pointing at a lizard. Thinking about 3 days that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. Finally, as the stars emerged overhead, Tarek stood and turned north, toward the territories where a man with his face could still move freely. Behind him, the settlement lights flickered like distant stars. He didn't look back. But for the first time in 15 years, walking away felt less like survival and more like running. And Tarek Voss wasn't sure which terrified him more. The settlement was called Redemption Creek, though Lillian learned quickly that redemption was in short supply. What it did have was water, a trading post that doubled as a general store, and 37 souls trying to carve out existence from unforgiving land. They were farmers mostly, a few prospectors who'd given up on gold and settled for survival, and families who'd come west chasing dreams that had downsized into simply staying alive. Martha Hayes, the woman who'd first taken them in, ran the boarding house with her husband Samuel. They were in their 50s, weathered by sun and hardship, but still possessing a kindness that felt almost out of place in the Arizona territory. Their own children had died years ago. Cholera, Martha explained matter-of-factly, as if speaking of weather, and they'd poured that parental instinct into anyone who needed it. "You'll stay with us as long as you need," Martha said the morning after their arrival, setting a plate of Johnny cakes in front of Lillian. No rush to figure things out. Michael ate ravenously, the first real meal he'd had in days disappearing in minutes. Lillian watched him, grateful beyond words, trying to ignore the guilt that gnawed at her every time she thought about the story she'd told. She hadn't lied, exactly. She just hadn't mentioned Tarek. "The attack," Samuel said carefully, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Did you get a good look at the men who did it?" Lillian's throat tightened. "It happened so fast. They wore bandanas, hats pulled low. I was hiding most of the time." "Smart, real smart," Samuel nodded approvingly. "Those raiders have hit 3 caravans this month. Territorial governors put together a militia, but they're always one step behind. Will they come here?" The fear in Lillian's voice wasn't feigned. "Nah, we're too small, too poor. They want easy targets with goods to steal, wagon trains heading to California, that sort of thing." Martha refilled Lillian's coffee. "You're safe here, dear. That's a promise." But safety felt like a lie when Lillian lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last conversation with Tarek. His face when he'd pulled away. The flatness in his voice when he'd called helping them a mistake. She told herself it didn't matter. He was a stranger who'd done his duty and moved on. She owed him her life, yes, but that debt was paid by survival, by living, by taking the second chance he'd given her and building something from it. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw him walking away into the rocks, shoulders straight despite the weight he carried, alone in a way that made her chest ache. 3 days passed in a blur of adjustment. Martha found Lillian some proper clothes to replace her torn dress. Samuel offered her work helping in the boarding house, cooking, cleaning, mending, in exchange for room and board. Michael began playing with the other children in the settlement, his silence slowly breaking apart as he rediscovered the resilience of youth. Life fell into a rhythm that should have been comforting. On the 4th day, riders came. Lillian was hanging laundry when she heard the horses, 6 men in cavalry uniforms, led by a captain with silver hair and hard eyes. The settlement gathered quickly, that mixture of curiosity and wariness that frontier people developed when authority arrived. "Captain Morrison," Samuel greeted him, shaking hands. "What brings the cavalry out this way?" Morrison dismounted, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "Looking for someone. Apache. Goes by the name Tarek Voss." Lillian's blood turned to ice. "Ghost Voss?" One of the prospectors whistled low. "Hell, Captain, that man's a legend. What makes you think he's anywhere near here?" "We've been tracking him for 3 weeks. Lost his trail in the storm 2 days ago, but our scout says he was heading south." Morrison pulled out a wanted poster, and Lillian's breath caught as she saw Tarek's face rendered in crude ink. $750, dead or alive. Anyone seen him? Silence. People shook their heads, murmured denials. Morrison's eyes landed on Lillian. "You're new here." It wasn't a question. Lillian forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. I arrived 4 days ago, my nephew and I. From where? We were part of a wagon train, attacked by raiders about 20 miles east of here. Everyone else died. We walked here. Morrison studied her, and Lillian felt the weight of his suspicion like a physical thing. 20 miles on foot with a child. That's impressive survival, ma'am. We were lucky. Lucky. Morrison repeated the word like he was tasting it for lies. See anyone else during your journey? Any Apaches? Lillian's mind raced. If she admitted seeing Tarek, they'd want details. Where, when, which direction he was heading. They'd use her as a tracker, follow the path she and Michael had taken, maybe even force her to guide them. And they'd kill him. Morrison's expression made that clear. This wasn't about justice or law. This was about eliminating a threat. No, she said firmly. We saw no one, just desert and more desert. Morrison held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If that changes, you let us know. Man like Voss, he's dangerous, killed a lot of good soldiers. Anyone helping him would be considered an accomplice. Understood, Captain. The cavalry stayed for an hour, questioning the settlement's residents, searching buildings with the kind of thoroughness that made it clear they believed Tarek had been there. They found nothing, of course, because he hadn't been. Finally, Morrison remounted his horse. We'll be patrolling this area for the next few weeks. You see anything suspicious, you fire 3 shots. We'll come running. He tipped his hat to the assembled crowd. Stay vigilant, folks. These are dangerous times. They rode out heading north, and Lillian felt something unclench in her chest, only to be replaced by a different kind of tension. Martha appeared at her elbow. You all right, dear? You've gone pale. I'm fine. Just the reminder of the attack. It shook me. Of course it did. Martha squeezed her shoulder. Come on inside. I'll make us some tea. That night, Lillian couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Morrison's face, hearing the certainty in his voice when he'd said dead or alive, imagining Tarek alone out there with an entire cavalry unit hunting him. It wasn't her problem. He'd made that clear. She had Michael to think about, a new life to build. Getting involved would be insane. But the image of him walking away kept playing in her mind, and with it came a realization that made her stomach twist. She was angry at him, furious actually, not for leaving. He'd warned her from the start that he would. But for the way he'd done it, with that flat dismissal, reducing 3 days of shared survival to a mistake. For the way he'd looked at her like she was naive for wanting to understand why he'd helped them in the first place. For the way he'd walked away from something that could have been more than just survival. The anger surprised her with its intensity. She barely knew this man. She had no claim on his choices, no right to his time or attention beyond the debt of gratitude she already owed. Yet the anger remained, burning quiet and steady beneath her ribs. 5 days after the cavalry's visit, Michael brought Lillian a flower he'd picked from the scrub near the creek. For you, he said shyly, pressing the small yellow bloom into her hand. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. It was the first time since his father's death that Michael had initiated any kind of affection. Thank you, sweetheart. It's beautiful. Miss Martha says flowers mean hope. She's right. They do. Michael looked up at her with those wide eyes that had seen too much too young. Miss Lily, are we going to stay here forever? I don't know yet. Would you like that? It's nice. The kids are nice, but... He trailed off, struggling with something. But what? I miss the man. The one who walked with us. Lillian's throat tightened. Tarek? Michael nodded. He showed me the lizard, and he gave me his shirt when I was cold. Is he okay? How did you explain to a 5-year-old that the man who'd saved them was being hunted like an animal? That soldiers wanted him dead for reasons Michael couldn't possibly understand? I think so, Lillian said carefully. He's very good at taking care of himself. But he was alone. That's sad. Out of the mouths of children, Lillian thought, hugging Michael close. Yes, sweetheart, it is sad. That night, lying in bed, Lillian made a decision that was probably foolish and possibly dangerous, but felt more right than anything had in days. She was going to find Tarek Voss, not to change his mind or convince him to stay, not even to thank him properly, though that was part of it, But because he'd been alone for 15 years, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be. Because Michael missed him, and because Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that walking away from this would haunt her for the rest of her life. The plan formed slowly over the next 2 days. She'd need supplies, food, water, a horse if possible. She'd need to leave Michael somewhere safe, which meant trusting Martha and Samuel with the truth. And she'd need to figure out where Tarek had gone. The last part seemed impossible until she remembered something he'd said that first night in the cave. My tribe scattered or imprisoned. If his people were imprisoned, there were only a few places they could be. Fort Apache was the largest, but there were smaller camps, temporary holdings where Apache families were kept under military supervision while the government decided their fate. Lillian spent an afternoon at the trading post, carefully asking questions disguised as curiosity. The clerk, an older man named Dutch, who'd been in the territory for 20 years, was happy to talk. Most of the Chiricahua got moved to San Carlos, he explained, pointing to a rough map on the wall. Big reservation, terrible conditions. Some smaller groups are still scattered. There's a holding camp about 40 miles northwest of here, near Eagle Creek. Military keeps about 50 people there, mostly women and children. Why keep them separate? Dutch shrugged. Government doesn't trust them together. Easier to manage in small groups, I guess. Not that it matters much. They're all suffering. Disease, starvation, broken promises. He shook his head. It's a shameful business, if you ask me. 40 miles northwest. Lillian studied the map, memorizing landmarks. You thinking of going out that way? Dutch asked, curious. No, just trying to understand the territory. Knowledge feels safer than ignorance. Smart woman, this land will kill the ignorant faster than anything. That evening, Lillian sat Martha and Samuel down and told them everything. Martha's eyes widened with each revelation. The Apache warrior, the 3-day journey, the cavalry hunting him. When Lillian finished, silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Let me make sure I understand, Samuel said slowly. You want to leave Michael with us? Take a horse and ride 40 miles into dangerous territory to find a wanted man who told you he didn't want your help. Yes. Why? Lillian had asked herself that question 100 times. The answers were complicated and simple all at once. Because he saved our lives when he had every reason not to. Because he's alone and hurt and convinced that's the only way to survive. Because a 5-year-old boy misses him, and that has to mean something. She paused. And because I can't just do nothing. I can't build a life here knowing I walked away from someone who needed help, even if he won't admit it. Martha and Samuel exchanged a long look, one of those wordless conversations that married couples developed over decades. You'll need supplies, Martha said finally. And you can't take one of the settlement's horses, too many questions. But there's a prospector about 5 miles south who owes Samuel a favor. He might loan you one. Lillian stared at her. You're not going to try to talk me out of this? Would it work? No. Then I won't waste my breath. Martha reached across the table and gripped Lillian's hand. But you listen to me. You take a rifle, you take enough water for 3 days, and you promise me that if you find this man and he tells you to leave, you respect that. You don't get to force salvation on someone who doesn't want it. I know. And you come back. Michael needs you more than that warrior does, no matter what your heart's telling you right now. Lillian felt tears threaten. I'll come back. I promise. Samuel stood. I'll talk to Crawford about the horse. And Lillian, be careful. The cavalry's still out there, and if they catch you helping Voss, they won't care that you're a woman. They'll see you as a criminal. I understand. 2 days later, before dawn broke over the desert, Lillian Cross kissed Michael's sleeping forehead, mounted a sturdy roan mare, and rode northwest toward Eagle Creek. The first day passed without incident. Lillian followed the landmarks Dutch had described, moving carefully through terrain that was becoming familiar in its hostility. The sun blazed overhead, the desert shimmered with heat, and twice she saw riders in the distance but managed to avoid them by staying low. She camped that night in a shallow ravine, building no fire, eating cold jerky and hardtack while the stars wheeled overhead. The silence was profound, broken only by distant coyotes and the occasional skitter of small creatures. Lillian tried not to think about what she'd do if Tarek wasn't near Eagle Creek, tried not to imagine riding 40 miles for nothing, or worse, finding him and having him reject her help with that same flat dismissal. The second day brought challenges. Her water ran lower than anticipated in the heat. The mare developed a slight limp that required Lillian to dismount and walk for several miles, checking the horse's hoof for stones. By late afternoon, she was exhausted, sunburned despite her hat, and starting to question her sanity. What was she doing out here? She was a school teacher from Missouri, not a frontier scout. She had no business tracking Apache warriors through hostile territory, but she kept moving because turning back felt like failure, and Lillian had already lost too much to accept one more defeat. The holding camp appeared on the afternoon of the third day. It was smaller than she'd expected, maybe a dozen crude shelters surrounded by a wooden palisade with cavalry tents pitched nearby. Even from a distance, Lillian could see the desperate conditions. Thin, ragged people moving slowly, soldiers watching with rifles ready, an atmosphere of depression that seemed to hang over the entire place like smoke. She found cover behind a rock outcropping and watched through Samuel's old spyglass. And there, standing at the edge of the camp talking to an older Apache woman, was Tarek. Lillian's heart jumped. He looked different somehow, less guarded, his posture slightly softer as he listened to whatever the woman was saying. She gestured emphatically, and Tarek nodded, his expression grave. Then a soldier approached, and Tarek's entire demeanor changed. He stepped back, his hand moving toward his knife, and the soldier raised his rifle. Lillian couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the tension in every line of Tarek's body. After a moment, the soldier gestured toward the camp entrance, and Tarek reluctantly moved in that direction, the woman following. They were forcing him to leave. Lillian waited until Tarek had walked beyond the palisade, heading north into the rocks, before she moved. She circled wide, staying out of sight of the camp, and positioned herself along the path he'd likely take. 20 minutes later, she heard footsteps. Tarek appeared around a boulder, moving with that same fluid silence, his eyes scanning the terrain, and froze when he saw her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. "You followed me," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "No, I tracked you. There's a difference." "Not much of one." He moved closer, and Lillian saw anger flash in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing out here, Lillian? You're supposed to be safe in Redemption Creek." "I was. I am. But what? You decided to risk your life riding 40 miles through dangerous territory because why exactly?" Lillian dismounted, standing her ground even as Tarek's anger rolled off him in waves. "Because Michael missed you. Because I wanted to make sure you were alive. Because you can't accept that some people are better off alone?" Tarek's voice was harsh. "I told you this was a mistake. I told you to move on. And I did, for about 5 days. Then the cavalry came looking for you." That stopped him. "Morrison?" "Captain Morrison, yes, silver hair, cold eyes. Absolutely certain he was going to find you and kill you." Lillian crossed her arms. "They searched the entire settlement, questioned everyone. I lied for you, by the way. Told them I'd never seen any Apache during our walk." Something shifted in Tarek's expression. "You lied to cavalry officers? Was I supposed to tell them the truth? Let them use me to track you down? You should have stayed out of it entirely." "Well, I didn't." Lillian's own anger flared now, hot and bright. "You don't get to save my life and then disappear and expect me to just forget about it. You don't get to call helping us a mistake and then walk away like we meant nothing." "You don't mean anything," Tarek said flatly. "You were people who needed help. I helped, that's all." "Liar." His eyes flashed dangerously. "Excuse me? You heard me. You're lying. If we meant nothing, you wouldn't have given Michael your shirt when he was cold. You wouldn't have shown him that lizard or asked about his favorite animal. You wouldn't have told me about the mountain lion or treated my wound or—" Her voice caught. "Or looked at me the way you did when you said goodbye. And how was that? Like it hurt. Like leaving was hard. Like maybe, just maybe, you were tired of being alone." Tarek's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about me." "Then tell me. Help me understand why you'd rather die alone out here than accept that someone might actually care whether you live or die. Because caring gets people killed." The words exploded out of him, raw and fierce. "Because everyone I've ever cared about is dead or imprisoned or scattered across a territory that's being stolen piece by piece. Because attachment is a target on your back in this world, and I can't. He stopped, breathing hard, and Lillian saw the cracks in his armor spreading wider. Can't what? She asked quietly. Can't watch someone else die because of me. His voice dropped. The woman in the camp, Naichi. She was married to my cousin. He died 3 months ago in a skirmish with cavalry. Starved himself first because the rations they give aren't enough to live on. Left behind 2 children who are skin and bones. Tarek's hands clenched into fists. That's what attachment looks like out here, Lillian. That's what caring costs. So forgive me if I'm not interested in adding you and Michael to the list of people I've failed. Lillian felt her anger drain away, replaced by an ache so profound it hurt to breathe. She stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Tarek pulled back. Don't. Why not? Because if you touch me with kindness right now, I'll break, and I can't afford to break. Maybe you need to, Lillian said softly. Maybe holding yourself together so tightly is what's really killing you. For a moment, she thought he might actually listen. His expression cracked open, revealing pain so deep and old it had become part of his foundation. He swayed slightly, as if the weight of 15 years was suddenly too much to carry. Then he shook his head, and the walls slammed back into place. Go back to Redemption Creek, he said quietly. Build your life. Raise Michael. Forget I exist. I can't do that. Why not? Because I see you, Lillian wanted to say. Because you're not just a warrior or a ghost or a wanted man. You're someone who's been hurt so badly you've forgotten how to accept anything good. Because in 3 days you showed me more courage and strength than I've seen in a lifetime, and I'm not ready to let that disappear. But what she said was, because you matter, whether you believe it or not. Tarek closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were carefully empty. Mattering is expensive. I can't afford the cost. He turned and walked away, and this time Lillian let him go. She stood there in the desert, watching him disappear into the rocks, feeling the same hollow ache she'd felt 5 days ago. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't giving up. Lillian didn't follow him immediately. She sat down on a flat rock, the desert sun beating against her shoulders, and forced herself to think clearly through the tangle of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Tarek was right about one thing. She couldn't force him to accept help he didn't want. But he was also wrong about something fundamental. He'd already let her in. Those 3 days of survival had created a bond whether he acknowledged it or not, and walking away wouldn't erase it. The question was what to do with that knowledge. She couldn't stay out here indefinitely. Michael needed her, and Martha and Samuel would worry. But riding back to Redemption Creek and pretending this conversation hadn't happened felt like betrayal, both to Tarek and to herself. The sound of hoofbeats shattered her contemplation. Lillian grabbed her rifle and scrambled behind the rocks just as riders appeared on the eastern ridge. 4 men, not in cavalry uniforms, but armed like soldiers. They moved with purpose, scanning the terrain, and Lillian's blood ran cold when she recognized the lead rider. He'd been one of the raiders at the wagon train. She'd seen his face for just a moment before Thomas had shoved her behind cover, but the image had burned itself into her memory, a scar running from his temple to his jaw, eyes flat and cruel. They were searching for something, or someone. Lillian stayed frozen as they passed within 20 yards of her position, their horses picking carefully through the rocky terrain. Their conversation drifted back in fragments. Tracks heading north. Cavalry's been all over this area. We need to move fast. Morrison wants him dead before sunset. Morrison, the cavalry captain. Understanding crashed through Lillian like ice water. These weren't just raiders. They were working with the military, or pretending to be raiders while actually serving Morrison's purposes. Either way, they were hunting Tarek, and they were close. She waited until they'd moved out of sight before emerging from cover. Her hand shook as she checked her rifle, making sure it was properly loaded this time. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have known which end of a gun to hold, and now she was preparing for possible combat. Tarek had gone north. The riders had gone north. The mathematics of that situation were brutally simple. Lillian mounted her horse and followed. She stayed well back, using the terrain for cover, moving as quietly as she could manage. The riders were easier to track than Tarek would have been. They left clear prints, broke branches, disturbed stones. They weren't trying to hide their passage because they assumed no one was following them. 20 minutes later, she heard the first gunshot. It came from a narrow canyon ahead, followed immediately by two more shots in rapid succession. Lillian urged her horse forward, her heart hammering, and dismounted at the canyon's entrance. The scene before her was chaos. Tarek had taken cover behind a fallen boulder, his rifle braced against the rock. Three of the riders had him pinned down, firing from positions higher up the canyon walls. The fourth lay motionless in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Even as Lillian watched, Tarek shifted position with fluid speed, fired twice, and one of the attackers cried out and fell. But the remaining two had better angles, and they were coordinating their shots, keeping Tarek suppressed. It was only a matter of time before they flanked him. Lillian's tactical experience amounted to exactly 0, but she understood basic geometry. The raiders were focused entirely on Tarek, their backs to the canyon entrance where she crouched. If she could get higher, find an angle they weren't expecting. She spotted a narrow path leading up the right canyon wall, partially hidden by scrub brush. Without letting herself think too hard about what she was doing, Lillian began climbing. The path was treacherous, loose rocks sliding beneath her boots, thorny plants catching at her clothes. She climbed as quietly as possible, her rifle slung across her back, using both hands to pull herself upward. Below, the gunfire continued, punctuated by shouted curses and the crack of bullets against stone. When she reached a small ledge about 30 feet up, Lillian could see the entire canyon spread below. Tarek was still pinned behind the boulder, bleeding from a wound on his left shoulder, but still fighting. The two remaining raiders had split up, one directly across from him, the other working his way around the canyon's edge for a killing angle. The flanking raider was closest to Lillian's position, maybe 40 yards away and completely focused on Tarek. Her hands trembled as she brought the rifle up, bracing it against a rock outcropping. She'd never shot at a person before. Never killed anything larger than a rattlesnake that had gotten too close to the boarding house. But she thought about Michael's face when he'd asked if Tarek was okay. She thought about Tarek's expression when he'd said, "Can't watch someone else die because of me." She thought about the wagon train massacre and Thomas's body and the casual cruelty of men who saw other people as obstacles to eliminate. Lillian pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, the noise deafening. Her shot went wide, striking rock near the raider's head, but it accomplished what she'd hoped. It shattered his focus. The man spun toward her position, his rifle swinging up, and Lillian fired again. This time, her aim was true. The raider stumbled backward and fell, sliding down the rocky slope. The remaining attacker, realizing he was now outnumbered, made a desperate break for his horse. Tarek rose from cover and fired once. The man's run became a collapse. Then silence crashed down over the canyon, broken only by Lillian's ragged breathing and the ringing in her ears. She stood on the ledge, the rifle heavy in her grip, staring at the body below. She'd done that. She'd killed a man. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, too large to process, too real to deny. "Lillian," Tarek's voice snapped her back to the present. "Don't move. The path down is unstable from this side." He was already climbing toward her, moving with that impossible grace despite his wounded shoulder. When he reached the ledge, he took the rifle from her shaking hands and set it aside carefully. "Are you hurt?" His eyes scanned her for injuries. Lillian shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Look at me." Tarek gripped her shoulders gently. "You're in shock. That's normal. Breathe slowly." "I killed him," she whispered. "Yes, you saved my life doing it." His voice was steady, anchoring. "I know that doesn't make it easier, but that man would have killed you without hesitation if given the chance. What you did was survival. You told me to go back to Redemption Creek. I did. I didn't listen." Something that might have been admiration flickered across Tarek's face. "No, you didn't." He released her shoulders and began examining his own wound, pressing a hand against the blood soaking through his shirt. "We need to move. Gunfire carries in these canyons. More might come." "Let me see that." Lillian pushed his hand away. Her training as a teacher, always the one patching up scraped knees and cut fingers, overriding her shock. The bullet had gouged a deep furrow across his shoulder, but appeared to have missed anything vital. "This needs to be cleaned and wrapped." "Later. Right now we need..." "Now." Lillian's voice came out harder than she'd intended. You can bleed to death just as easily from an infection as from a bullet. Sit down. Tarek stared at her, clearly unused to being ordered around, then slowly sat. You're different than you were 10 days ago. 10 days ago, I'd never been attacked by raiders or walked 40 miles through desert or shot a man. Lillian tore strips from her petticoat, using them to bind his shoulder. People change when the world demands it. Not always for the better. No, not always. She tied off the bandage, her hand steadier now that she had a task. But sometimes survival looks like strength, and strength looks like doing things you never thought you could. Tarek watched her face as she worked. You shouldn't have come back. Probably not, but I did anyway. Why? Lillian met his eyes. Because you would have done the same for me. He had no answer for that, and they descended the canyon in silence. At the bottom, Tarek methodically searched the dead men, taking ammunition and canteens. Lillian forced herself to look at the raider she'd shot, committing his face to memory. If she was going to carry this weight, she wouldn't pretend it hadn't happened. They were working with Morrison, she said quietly. Tarek looked up sharply. How do you know? I heard them talking before the shooting started. They mentioned Morrison by name, said he wanted you dead before sunset. She paused. They're not regular cavalry, are they? Mercenaries, most likely. Morrison's been using them for months, sends them to do things the cavalry can't officially do. Assassinations, massacres. Then blames it on renegade Apaches to justify more military action. Tarek stood, his expression grim. If they were reporting to Morrison, he knows I'm in this area. He'll send more. Then we leave. Go somewhere he can't follow. We? Lillian crossed her arms. Did you really think I rode 40 miles just to have one conversation and leave? That would have been the smart choice. I'm starting to think smart choices are overrated. She moved to her horse, checking the saddlebags. I have supplies for 3 days. Where's the nearest place Morrison's men won't look? Tarek was quiet for a long moment, and Lillian could practically see him fighting with himself, the ingrained instinct to refuse help warring with the practical reality of his situation. Finally, he said, There's a settlement about 60 miles west, small Apache community that's managed to stay off the reservation through a combination of isolation and good relations with local ranchers. They'd take us in. Us? You killed a man to protect me. That makes you a target now, too. His voice was flat, but she heard the guilt underneath. If Morrison's men saw you, or if someone connects you to this, you can't go back to Redemption Creek. It won't be safe. The reality of that crashed over Lillian, Martha and Samuel, Michael, the life she'd just started building. All of it potentially gone because she'd made a choice to help. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Then we go west, she said simply. Just like that? What else would I do? Stay here and wait for more mercenaries to arrive? Lillian mounted her horse. Besides, you're injured and in no condition to argue. So unless you plan to knock me unconscious and tie me to a tree, I'm coming with you. Tarek actually smiled. A small, brief thing, but real. You're insane. I prefer adaptable. Lillian offered him her hand. Are you going to stand there bleeding, or are we leaving? He took her hand, his grip strong despite the wound, and pulled himself up behind her on the horse. The mare shifted under the additional weight, but held steady. As they rode west, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Lillian felt Tarek's arms around her waist for balance and tried not to think about how right it felt. How despite the danger and death, an impossible situation they were in, some part of her had never felt more certain of a choice. Behind them, smoke from the canyon began to rise. Tarek had set fire to dry brush to confuse their trail. Ahead, the desert stretched endless and unforgiving, and between them, something unspoken settled into place. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and change Tarek's bandage. Lillian could feel his exhaustion in the way he leaned heavier against her back as the hours passed, could see the pain lines deepening around his eyes. We should stop, she said when they reached a small creek bed. You need real rest. Not yet. We need more distance between us and… Tarek. She twisted to look at him. You're barely conscious. If we get attacked now, you'll be useless. Let me keep watch while you sleep. You don't know how to keep watch. Then teach me. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 2 hours. Then we move again. They made a cold camp in a depression hidden by rocks and scrub. Tarek showed Lillian how to position herself to see the approaches, what sounds to listen for, which shadows to watch. If you see anything at all, wake me immediately, he instructed. Don't try to handle it yourself. I just shot a man to save your life. I think I can handle a watch. That was different. You had surprise and elevation. Out here, you'd be facing trained killers on even ground. His voice softened. I need you to promise me, Lillian. If trouble comes, you wake me. No heroics. Fine. I promise. Tarek lay down, and within minutes his breathing deepened into sleep. Lillian sat with the rifle across her knees, watching the desert slowly lighten as dawn approached. She thought about Michael, probably waking up in Martha's house right now, asking where she'd gone. She'd left a letter explaining she'd had to leave, that she'd come back when it was safe, that he should be good for Martha and Samuel. But letters were poor substitutes for presents, and Michael had already lost too many people. Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and insistent. What kind of person abandoned a 5-year-old to chase after a man who'd explicitly said he didn't want help? But then she looked at Tarek, at the exhaustion carved into his face even in sleep, at the bandage slowly staining red on his shoulder, and knew she couldn't have made a different choice. Some things transcended logic or wisdom. Some things simply had to be done. Movement on the eastern ridge caught her attention. Lillian tensed, bringing the rifle up slowly, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain. There. A figure moving between boulders, low and careful. She reached back and shook Tarek's leg. He was awake instantly, his hand going to his knife. East Ridge, she whispered. Single person, I think. Moving toward us. Tarek rose into a crouch, his eyes following where she pointed. They waited in tense silence as the figure descended, getting closer. Then Tarek relaxed slightly. It's all right. I know her. The woman who emerged from the rocks was Apache, maybe 40 years old, with gray streaking through her long black hair. She moved with the same fluid grace as Tarek, her eyes sharp and assessing as they landed on Lillian. She spoke in Apache, rapid words that Lillian couldn't follow. Tarek responded in kind, gesturing to his wounded shoulder, then to Lillian. The woman's gaze sharpened on Lillian, something like surprise crossing her face. She asked a question, and Tarek answered with what sounded like reluctance. Finally, the woman switched to English. You are the one who killed Morrison's man? Lillian straightened. Yes. Good. He deserved worse than a bullet. She moved closer, examining Tarek's shoulder with the efficiency of someone who'd treated many wounds. This is infected already. You need proper medicine, not field dressing. Nietzsche, we're heading to the western settlement. Too far. You'll be fevered before noon. Nietzsche pulled herbs from a pouch at her belt. There's a canyon 3 miles south. Hidden water source, shelter. I can treat this properly there. Morrison's men are searching north and east. They assume you'd run toward your old territories. Nietzsche's expression was grim. But they'll widen their search soon. We don't have much time. Tarek looked at Lillian. Your choice. We can try to make the western settlement, or we trust Nietzsche. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Tarek was clearly getting worse, his skin too warm when Lillian had touched his arm. We go south. The canyon Nietzsche led them to was a hidden sanctuary, a narrow cleft in the rocks that opened into a small grotto with a spring-fed pool and enough vegetation to provide shade and cover. Water trickled down moss-covered walls, and the air was noticeably cooler than the desert outside. How did you find us? Lillian asked as Nietzsche began preparing medicine. I've been tracking Tarek for 2 days. Wanted to warn him about Morrison's increased patrols. Nietzsche ground herbs with practiced motions. I didn't expect to find him traveling with a white woman. It's temporary, Tarek said, his voice tight with pain. Is it? Nietzsche's eyes moved between them with knowing intensity. The way you look at her suggests otherwise. Nietzsche, quiet. Let me work. She began cleaning Tarek's wound, and he hissed through clenched teeth. This woman. She's the one from the wagon train? The one you helped? Yes. And she came back for you, rode into danger to find you, killed to protect you. Naichi paused in her work. Do you understand what that means in our culture? Tarek's jaw tightened. It means she made a foolish choice. It means she's claimed you as worthy of protection. It means she's chosen to bind her fate to yours. Naichi applied a poultice that made Tarek flinch. Whether you accept that bond or not. Well, Lillian watched this exchange, understanding only fragments but sensing the weight of what was being discussed. What's she talking about? Tarek wouldn't meet her eyes. Nothing. Old traditions that don't apply anymore. Don't lie to her, Naichi said sharply. She's earned truth. She turned to Lillian. Among my people, when someone risks their life to protect another in battle, it creates a bond, a responsibility. It says that you see this person as worth saving, worth fighting for, worth standing beside. I do, Lillian said quietly. Even knowing he's hunted? Even knowing that staying with him means you become hunted too? Yes. Naichi smiled and it transformed her face. Then you're either very brave or very stupid, possibly both. She finished wrapping Tarek's shoulder with clean cloth. The infection will break by tomorrow if he rests and drinks the tea I'll prepare. But Tarek, you need to decide what you're doing. Running forever isn't sustainable. Eventually Morrison will corner you. What would you have me do? Turn myself in? Let them execute me for defending my people? I would have you stop running alone. Naichi gestured to Lillian. She's here. She's chosen to stand with you. Perhaps it's time you let someone. Last time I let people close, they died. Last time you were a different man, younger, angrier, less wise. Naichi stood, gathering her supplies. And she's not asking you to let her close. She's already there, whether you acknowledge it or not. She left them in the grotto, disappearing back into the rocks with instructions to stay hidden until she returned. Silence settled over them, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Lillian spoke. What did she mean about traditions? About bonds? Tarek stared at the water trickling down the canyon wall. In Apache culture, battle creates connections. When someone fights beside you, sheds blood to protect you, they become part of your story, your responsibility. He paused. And you become part of theirs. So by saving your life, I've, claimed you? Something like that. Lillian absorbed this. And you? Do you have a choice in this bond? Of course, it's not ownership, it's... He struggled for words. An acknowledgement. A recognition that our lives are intertwined now, whether we planned it or not. Do you want them to be intertwined? Tarek finally looked at her, and Lillian saw the conflict written plainly across his face. Want versus fear. Hope versus experience. The possibility of connection battling against 15 years of learned isolation. What I want doesn't matter, he said quietly. It's the only thing that matters. You don't understand. Everything I want turns to ash. Everyone I care about ends up dead or destroyed. It's not superstition. It's pattern. It's fact. Lillian moved closer, sitting beside him near the water. Then maybe it's time to break the pattern. And if I can't? If I get you killed like I've gotten everyone else killed? Then that's a risk I'm taking with full knowledge. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. I'm not asking you to change who you are or abandon your survival instincts. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe surviving doesn't have to mean being alone. Tarek's fingers tightened on hers. I don't know how to do this. This caring. I've spent so long shutting it down that I don't remember how to let it in. Then we figure it out together, one day at a time. They sat like that as the sun climbed higher outside their hidden sanctuary, casting shifting patterns of light across the water. Tarek's fever was rising. Lillian could feel the heat radiating from his skin, but his grip on her hand remained steady. Tell me about Michael, he said suddenly. How is he? The question surprised her. He misses you. He talks about the lizard you showed him. The desert spiny. Yes. He asked if you were okay, if you were still alone. Lillian swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I told him I thought you were, but that maybe you didn't have to be. What did he say? That being alone is sad. She smiled slightly. Out of the mouths of children, right? Tarek was quiet for a moment. He's a good kid, strong, resilient. He is, and he deserves to grow up in a world where that strength gets rewarded, not punished. Lillian paused. I left him with Martha and Samuel, left a letter saying I'd come back when it was safe, but now you're not sure when safe will come, or if it will at all. I'm sorry. Tarek's voice was rough. This is my fault. If I'd just kept walking that first day, if I'd left you and Michael to your fate, then we'd be dead. And you'd still be alone, still running, still convinced that isolation is the only answer. Lillian squeezed his hand. Some fates are better than others, even if they're harder. Tarek pulled her closer, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, feeling his heartbeat against her back, steady and strong, despite the fever. I don't deserve you, he murmured into her hair. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. He laughed, actually laughed, a low sound that rumbled through his chest. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. They stayed like that until Tarek's fever pulled him into restless sleep. Lillian kept watch, one hand on her rifle, the other still holding his, and tried not to think about all the ways this could end badly. Instead, she focused on the fact that for the first time since the wagon train massacre, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Even if that place was a hidden canyon in hostile territory, holding the hand of a wanted man while armed mercenaries searched for them both. Sometimes rightness had nothing to do with safety. Sometimes it was just about choosing who you stood beside when the world demanded you make a stand. And Lillian had made her choice. Tarek's fever broke just before dawn, sweat soaking through the makeshift bedding Lillian had fashioned from saddle blankets. She'd stayed awake through the night, bathing his forehead with cool water from the spring, forcing him to drink Naichi's bitter tea whenever he surfaced enough to swallow. In his delirium, he'd spoken in Apache, words tumbling out in fragments that Lillian couldn't understand but felt in her bones, names of people long dead, pleas for forgiveness, defiant challenges to enemies she couldn't see. Once, he'd gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise and said in English, "Don't follow me there, it's too dark." She'd whispered back, "Then I'll bring light," though she knew he couldn't hear her. Now, as gray dawn filtered into the grotto, Tarek's eyes opened clear for the first time in 12 hours. "You're still here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Where else would I be? Safe, somewhere far from me." He tried to sit up and winced, falling back against the blankets. How long was I out? Most of a day. Naichi said the infection would break quickly once the medicine took hold. She was right. Lillian helped him drink water, supporting his head. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses and left for the buzzards." He managed a weak smile. "So, better than yesterday." "The bar is remarkably low." Tarek caught her hand as she pulled away. "Thank you. For staying. For all of it." "You don't need to thank me for—" "Yes, I do." His grip tightened. "I've spent 15 years convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that wanting connection was weakness. And then you show up and shatter every defense I've built, and I don't know whether to be grateful or terrified." "Why not both?" He actually laughed, though it turned into a cough. "Both seems accurate." Naichi returned as the sun climbed above the canyon walls, carrying supplies bundled in cloth. She examined Tarek's shoulder with clinical efficiency, nodding with satisfaction. "The infection is gone. You'll have a scar, but you'll live." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing dried meat, flatbread, and fresh herbs. "Eat. You need strength for what's coming." "What's coming?" Lillian asked. Naichi's expression turned grim. "Morrison knows you're in this region. He's quadrupled his patrols and brought in more mercenaries. They're searching systematically, closing the net." She paused. "You can't run fast enough to stay ahead of them much longer." "Then what do we do?" Tarek sat up slowly, accepting the food she offered. "We can't fight an entire cavalry unit and a dozen hired killers." "No. But you can disappear so thoroughly, they'll never find you." Naichi turned to Lillian. "There's a place, 3 days hard ride northwest, an Apache settlement in the mountains that the government doesn't know about. Hidden valleys, defensible positions, people who know how to stay invisible." "Your tribe?" Lillian asked. "What's left of it? Maybe 30 families, all who refused reservation life, all who'd rather die free than live imprisoned." Naichi's eyes found Tarek. They'd welcome you. You're one of us, even if you've been alone for too long. Tarek set down the food, his expression conflicted. If Morrison follows us there, we'd be leading him straight to them. I won't put more people at risk. Morrison won't follow. He can't. The terrain is too difficult for large cavalry units, and his mercenaries won't risk going into the high country where they're outnumbered. Naichi leaned forward. But you need to decide now. Every hour you wait, the net gets tighter. What about Michael? Lillian's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. I can't just disappear. He's 5 years old and I promised I'd come back. Naichi studied her. The boy you left in Redemption Creek? Yes. He's my nephew. My responsibility. Then send for him. Lillian stared. What? Send word through people you trust. Have them bring the child to a meeting point where we can collect him safely. Naichi spoke as if this were the most logical solution in the world. Morrison is hunting Tarek, not you specifically. If you're careful, if the boy travels with people who appear to be ordinary settlers, there's no reason they'd be stopped. Hope and fear warred in Lillian's chest. That's incredibly dangerous. So is everything else you've done in the past 2 weeks? Naichi's expression softened slightly. The child has already lost his parents. Don't make him lose you too by trying to protect him from risks that might never materialize. Tarek was watching Lillian's face. It's your choice. But Naichi is right. If you want Michael with you, we can make it happen. And if something goes wrong, if Morrison's men intercept them, then we adapt. We fight. We survive. Tarek's voice carried absolute certainty. But we do it together. The word together settled over Lillian like a promise and a challenge. She thought about Michael's face when he'd given her that desert flower, about his quiet question asking if Tarek was okay, about the resilience children possessed when the adults in their lives showed them it was safe to be strong. All right, she said. We send for him. But I write the message myself, and we choose the route carefully. Naichi smiled. Smart. I know a rancher who owes me favors. He makes regular supply runs to Redemption Creek. He can deliver your message and bring the boy back without raising suspicion. They spent the next hour planning. Lillian wrote a letter to Martha and Samuel explaining as much as she dared, that she was safe, that she needed Michael with her, that trusted people would come to collect him. She included details only Martha would know, small facts about their journey west that would prove the letter's authenticity. They'll think I've lost my mind, Lillian said as she sealed the envelope with wax Naichi provided. Probably, Tarek agreed. But they'll also trust that you have reasons for what you're doing. Do I? Have good reasons? He looked at her steadily. You're trying to keep your family together while protecting a man who's hunted by people who'd kill him on sight. Those seem like good reasons to me. Even if it means dragging a child into dangerous territory? The entire frontier is dangerous territory. At least in the mountains, he'd be surrounded by people who know how to survive it. Tarek paused. And he'd be with you. That matters more than safety. Lillian folded the letter carefully, adding a small drawing Michael had made of a horse, something only he would have given her, more proof of authenticity. What if I'm making a terrible mistake? Then you'll be making it for the right reasons. That counts for something. Naichi took the letter and disappeared again, promising to return in 2 days with news. In the meantime, she instructed them to stay hidden in the grotto and recover their strength. Alone again, Tarek and Lillian fell into a strange domestic rhythm. She changed his bandages while he taught her to identify edible plants growing near the spring. He showed her how to move silently through terrain while she taught him a card game her father had loved. They talked about everything and nothing. Childhoods that felt like they'd happened to different people, dreams that had been abandoned or transformed, fears they'd never spoken aloud. On the second evening, as they sat by the spring watching stars emerge overhead, Tarek asked the question Lillian had been waiting for. What happens after? Assuming we make it to the settlement, assuming Michael arrives safely, assuming Morrison gives up the hunt, what then? Lillian trailed her fingers through the cool water. I don't know, I hadn't thought that far ahead. Liar. She smiled despite herself. Fine. I've thought about it, but the future feels impossible to predict when the present is so uncertain. Try anyway. I want Michael to be safe. I want him to grow up knowing he's loved and valued. She hesitated. I want to stop running, to build something that lasts instead of just surviving day to day. And me? Do I fit into that vision? Lillian turned to face him fully. Do you want to? Tarek was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. I've spent 15 years alone because I thought it was the only way to stay alive. But these past weeks with you have made me question whether staying alive is the same thing as living. He reached for her hand. I don't know how to do this, how to care about someone without waiting for them to be taken away. But I want to learn. If you're patient enough to teach me. I'm not patient. I'm stubborn. There's a difference. Good. Because this won't be easy. I'm wanted by the cavalry, hunted by mercenaries, and carrying 15 years of trauma that doesn't disappear just because I acknowledge it. And I'm a school teacher from Missouri who's killed a man, abandoned her nephew temporarily, and fallen for an Apache warrior in the middle of a territory that wants us both dead or gone. Lillian squeezed his hand. We're both disasters. At least we match. Tarek pulled her closer, his good arm wrapping around her waist. When did you become so brave? When someone showed me that survival was worth fighting for. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Lillian kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been carrying since the moment she'd decided to track him down, pouring weeks of fear and hope and defiance into the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Tarek rested his forehead against hers. If Morrison finds us, he said quietly, if things go wrong, then we'll face it together, no more running alone. Together, he repeated, as if testing the word. I like how that sounds. They stayed like that until the stars filled the sky completely, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and decided that impossible odds were no reason to stop fighting for something worth keeping. Nietzsche returned on the third day with news both good and troubling. The letter is delivered. The rancher will collect the boy in 4 days and bring him to the meeting point a week from now. She pulled dried meat from her pack, distributing it between them. But Morrison has increased his bounty. $1,000 now, and he's spreading word that you killed 3 of his men. I did, Tarek said flatly. No, you killed 1. She killed 1. Nietzsche gestured to Lillian. Morrison killed the 3rd himself when the man failed to kill you, then blamed it on you to justify the increased bounty. Lillian felt cold spread through her chest. He killed his own man? Morrison doesn't tolerate failure, and he needs Tarek dead before anyone starts questioning his methods. Nietzsche's expression was grim. The territorial governor is coming to inspect military operations next month. Morrison can't afford to have a living Apache warrior around who might contradict his reports about pacified tribes. So this isn't just about me being a threat. It's about covering up his crimes. Exactly. Which makes him more dangerous because desperate men make reckless choices. Nietzsche stood. We leave at nightfall. The journey to the settlement will take 3 hard days through difficult terrain. Can you both manage it? Tarek tested his wounded shoulder, rotating it carefully. I'll manage. And you? Nietzsche looked at Lillian. This isn't like riding through open desert. The mountain paths are narrow, steep, sometimes barely wide enough for a horse. One wrong step means a fatal fall. I'll manage too. Nietzsche nodded approvingly. Good. Because once we start, we can't stop. Morrison's patrols are everywhere, and if they catch us in the open, we die. They prepared through the afternoon, checking weapons, redistributing supplies, ensuring the horse was rested and ready. Lillian felt the weight of what they were about to attempt settling over her like a physical thing, but alongside the fear was a strange excitement. She was done being passive, done letting circumstances dictate her choices. If she was going to build a life worth living, it started with taking control of her own fate. As the sun set, painting the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold, they mounted up and followed Nietzsche out of the grotto. The journey was everything Nietzsche had promised and worse. They traveled only at night, navigating by starlight in Nietzsche's intimate knowledge of the land. The paths were treacherous, sometimes little more than animal trails clinging to cliff faces, other times winding through boulder fields where one misplaced hoof could mean disaster. Twice they heard cavalry patrols in the distance and had to hide for hours, barely breathing while soldiers passed within shouting distance. Once they encountered a mountain lion that Naichi scared off with a combination of noise and thrown rocks, though not before the creature had Lillian's heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Tarek rode behind Lillian, his injured shoulder making it difficult to maintain balance on the steep paths. She could feel him struggling, could hear the occasional sharp intake of breath when the horse stumbled, but he never complained. On the second night, they stopped at a narrow ledge barely wide enough for the three of them and the horse. Below, darkness dropped away into nothing, a fall that would kill instantly. "Rest here," Naichi instructed. "We've made good time. The settlement is just beyond the next ridge." Lillian dismounted on shaking legs, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. Tarek slid down beside her, immediately checking the horse before seeing to his own needs. "You should sleep," he told Lillian. "We'll take watch in shifts." "I'm fine." "You're barely standing. Sleep. That's not a request." Too tired to argue, Lillian curled up against a boulder and fell into unconsciousness, so complete that when Tarek shook her awake hours later, she initially had no idea where she was. "Time to move," he said quietly. "We're almost there." The final approach to the settlement came with dawn breaking over the mountains. Naichi led them through a narrow pass that opened suddenly into a hidden valley, green and lush, fed by mountain streams, utterly invisible from below. And there, scattered across the valley floor like seeds that had taken root in impossible soil, were homes. Not the crude structures Lillian had seen at the holding camp, but real dwellings, adobe and wood, built with care and permanence. Smoke rose from morning fires. Children played near a central stream. People moved between buildings with the casual confidence of those who felt safe. It was beautiful and completely unexpected. "Welcome to what remains of the free Chirikawa," Naichi said, pride evident in her voice. "Welcome home, Tarek." But as they descended into the valley, Lillian saw the faces turning toward them, curious, wary, and in some cases, hostile. A woman approached quickly, speaking rapid Apache to Naichi, her gestures sharp and questioning. Naichi responded calmly, gesturing to Tarek, then to Lillian. The woman's eyes widened with recognition when she looked at Tarek, but narrowed with suspicion when they landed on Lillian. More people gathered, men and women, elders and warriors, all studying the newcomers with varying degrees of welcome and distrust. An older man stepped forward, his face weathered but his posture straight and commanding. He spoke to Tarek in Apache, his tone formal, almost ceremonial. Tarek responded in kind, then switched to English, glancing at Lillian. "This is Chief Nantan. He leads the settlement." To Nantan he continued in English. "I've brought someone who saved my life, who fought beside me, who asks for sanctuary." Nantan's gaze settled on Lillian with the weight of judgment. "This is a white woman." "Yes." "Who brings the eyes of the cavalry wherever she goes." "We were careful. We weren't followed." "So you believe. But belief and fact are not the same thing." Nantan stepped closer to Lillian, studying her with intensity that made her want to step back. She held her ground. "Why should we risk our people's safety for you?" Lillian met his eyes steadily. "Because I have nowhere else to go. Because I killed to protect one of yours. Because I'm asking for the same chance you'd give anyone else who came in peace." She paused. "And because I'm bringing a child, my nephew, who deserves to grow up knowing that the world has places where people help each other instead of destroying each other." Nantan was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Tarek. "You vouch for her? With my life?" "That may be exactly what it costs." Nantan looked back at Lillian. "Our survival depends on invisibility, on the outside world forgetting we exist. You are a visible woman, white, educated, not easily dismissed or overlooked. Your presence here is a risk." "Every person here is a risk," Lillian countered. "Every child playing by that stream is a risk to someone who'd rather see them imprisoned or dead. I'm just asking to share that risk rather than face it alone." Something that might have been respect flickered across Nantan's face. He spoke in Apache to the assembled crowd, his words measured and deliberate. Some nodded. Others looked unconvinced. Naichi added her voice, speaking with passionate intensity. Finally, Nantan raised his hand for silence. "We will allow you to stay, he said to Lillian. Temporarily. You will be watched. You will prove through actions that you can be trusted. And if you bring danger to us, you will leave, with or without Tarek's protection. It wasn't a warm welcome, but it was a chance. Thank you, Lillian said simply. Nantan nodded once, then turned and walked away. The crowd began to disperse, though Lillian felt their eyes still on her, measuring, judging, waiting to see who she really was. Nietzsche touched Lillian's shoulder. That went better than I expected. Nantan is cautious, but he's fair. Prove yourself useful, prove you can adapt, and they'll accept you. And if I can't, then you'll be alone again. But somehow, I don't think that will happen. Nietzsche smiled. You have something many people lack, the ability to see past differences to common ground. That will serve you well here. A woman approached, younger than Nietzsche, carrying a small child on her hip. She spoke to Tarek in Apache, her expression warm, and he responded with what looked like genuine affection. My sister Desba, Nietzsche explained to Lillian. She's offering you a place to sleep and food. Accept graciously. Hospitality is sacred here. Lillian nodded to Desba, who smiled and gestured for them to follow. They were led to a small dwelling at the valley's edge, modest but well-maintained. Inside it was cool and dim, with sleeping mats laid out and a small fire pit in the center. Desba spoke to Tarek, who translated. She says you're welcome to stay here until you build your own home. She asks only that you respect the space and help with daily tasks. Tell her thank you. I'm grateful for her kindness. Tarek relayed this, and Desba's smile widened. She set down a basket of food, flatbread, dried fruit, something that looked like stew, and left with a final nod. Alone again, Lillian sank onto one of the sleeping mats, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. We made it, she said, almost disbelieving. We made it, Tarek echoed. He sat beside her, wincing as his shoulder protested. Now comes the hard part. What's harder than 3 days of mountain trails and evading cavalry patrols? Building a life, earning trust, figuring out how two people from completely different worlds actually make this work. He looked at her seriously. They're watching you, Lillian. Every move you make will either prove you belong here or confirm their suspicions that you don't. Then I'll prove I belong. She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. I've come too far to fail now. We've come too far, he corrected gently. This isn't just your challenge. It's ours. Outside, the sounds of the settlement drifted through the walls. Children laughing, someone singing, the rhythmic sound of something being pounded. Normal sounds, community sounds. For the first time since the wagon train massacre, Lillian allowed herself to imagine a future that looked like peace instead of survival. It wouldn't be easy. She'd have to learn a new language, new customs, new ways of being. She'd have to prove herself daily to people who had every reason to distrust her. And always, in the background, would be the threat of Morrison and his men, the cavalry patrols, the reality that their sanctuary was only as permanent as their ability to remain hidden. But she'd faced impossible odds before and survived. And this time, she wouldn't be facing them alone. Tarek's hand found hers in the dim light, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. Thank you, he said quietly, for not giving up on me, for choosing this even when you had easier options. Easy options are overrated, Lillian murmured, her eyes already closing with exhaustion. I prefer impossible ones with you. She felt him smile against her hair as sleep finally claimed her, pulling her down into darkness that for once felt safe instead of threatening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in a hidden valley surrounded by mountains and protected by people who knew how to survive against impossible odds, Lillian Cross allowed herself to rest and to hope. The first week in the settlement tested Lillian in ways she hadn't anticipated. The physical challenges, learning to grind corn in the traditional way, carrying water from the stream in clay vessels balanced on her hip, helping repair adobe walls damaged by recent rains, were exhausting but manageable. It was the scrutiny that wore her down, the constant awareness that every action was being evaluated, every mistake noted and discussed. She learned quickly that the women controlled much of the settlement's daily rhythm, and their acceptance would determine whether she truly belonged here or remained a perpetual outsider. Desba became an unlikely ally, teaching Lillian basic Apache words and correcting her pronunciation with patient persistence. Other women were less welcoming, particularly an older woman named Ishta, who made no secret of her distrust. "She says you smell like the cavalry," Naichi translated one afternoon as Ishta addressed the group of women working near the stream. "That white women bring soldiers the way carrion brings vultures." Lillian looked directly at Ishta, keeping her voice steady. "Tell her I understand her fear. Tell her I've lost people to violence too, and I would cut off my own hand before I'd bring harm to those who've shown me shelter." Naichi translated, and Ishta's eyes narrowed. She responded with a long string of Apache, her tone sharp. "She says words are wind," Naichi said quietly. "Only time reveals truth." "Then I'll wait for time to speak for me." The exchange spread through the settlement, and Lillian felt the weight of judgment intensify. That night, as she and Tarek sat outside their dwelling watching stars emerge, she voiced her frustration. "I'm trying everything I can think of, learning the language, working harder than anyone else, respecting every custom Desba teaches me. But Ishta and others like her will never accept me. I can see it in their eyes." Tarek was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the back of her hand. Ishta lost her husband and 2 sons to cavalry raids. Her daughter was taken to a reservation and died there from disease. To her, you represent everything that's destroyed her world. I'm not responsible for what the cavalry did. No, but you benefit from the same system that allowed it to happen. That's not fair, but it's reality. He turned to face her. You can't win everyone over, Lillian. Some wounds are too deep. All you can do is prove through your actions that you're different from what she expects. And if that's not enough, then you accept it and focus on those who are willing to see you for who you are, rather than what you represent. It was practical advice, but it didn't ease the ache of being viewed as a threat when all she wanted was to belong. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Nantan summoned Lillian to the central gathering area where the settlement's leaders assembled. Tarek tried to accompany her, but Nantan shook his head. This is for her alone. She must answer for herself. Lillian walked into the circle of elders with her spine straight and her fear carefully hidden. Nantan stood at the center, flanked by Ishta and 2 other older men whose names Lillian hadn't learned yet. "We have discussed your presence here," Nantan began without preamble. "Some argue you should be sent away before you bring danger. Others say you've proven nothing yet, good or bad. I have decided to offer you a choice." Lillian's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "What choice?" "In our tradition, when an outsider seeks to join the tribe, they must undergo trials. Tests that prove their strength, their wisdom, their commitment." Nantan's gaze was unflinching. "You are not Apache. You were not born to our ways. But Tarek speaks for you, and that carries weight. So I offer you this. Undergo 3 trials over 3 days. Pass them, and you will be accepted as one of us. Fail, and you leave when the child arrives." The implications crashed over Lillian. If she failed, she'd be separated from Tarek. Michael would arrive to find her preparing to leave. Everything she'd fought for would dissolve. "What are the trials?" "You will learn when the time comes. Each will test a different aspect of what it means to survive and contribute to our community." Nantan paused. "Do you accept?" Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that the trials were likely designed to make her fail. But backing down now would prove all her doubters right, that she was too weak, too soft, too fundamentally different to ever truly belong. "I accept." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd that had formed around the edges of the meeting area. Nantan nodded slowly, and something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered face. "The first trial begins at dawn. Prepare yourself." Tarek found her immediately after, his expression torn between pride and concern. "You didn't have to agree to this." "Yes, I did. It's the only way they'll ever truly accept me. If I prove myself on their terms, not mine. These trials won't be easy. They're designed to push you to your absolute limits." "Good. I'm tired of being seen as fragile." Lillian looked at him steadily. "I've walked through desert, shot a man, ridden 3 days through mountain passes, and survived a wagon train massacre. I think I can handle whatever Nantan throws at me." "That's not confidence talking. That's stubbornness. Like I said before, there's a difference. She managed a smile. Trust me? Tarek pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with fierce protectiveness. Always. But that doesn't mean I won't worry. That night, Lillian barely slept. She lay awake running through possibilities, trying to anticipate what the trials might involve. Physical endurance seemed likely. These were people who'd survived by being tougher than their environment. But Nantan had mentioned wisdom too, which suggested something more complex than simple strength. Dawn came too quickly. Lillian rose, dressed in the practical clothing Desba had provided, and walked to the central area where Nantan waited. The first trial is endurance, he announced to the assembled crowd. You will run to the northern ridge and back. The path is marked with stones. You may not stop, you may not walk, you may not accept help from anyone. Complete the run before the sun reaches its peak, and you pass. Lillian looked at the ridge in question, barely visible in the morning haze. It had to be 5 miles away, maybe more. 10 miles total, over mountain terrain, in the growing heat. I understand. Then begin. She started running. The first mile wasn't terrible. Lillian had walked enough in recent weeks to build some endurance, and adrenaline carried her forward. But as the path began to climb, her lungs started burning. The thin mountain air made every breath feel insufficient, and the sun climbed with merciless speed. At 3 miles, her legs were screaming. At 4, she stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself against a boulder. The temptation to walk, just for a minute, was overwhelming. But she could see people watching from various points along the route, judging her every move. She kept running. Somewhere around mile 6, on the descent back, Lillian's body moved into a state beyond pain. Her legs pumped mechanically, her breathing found a rhythm, and her mind detached slightly from the physical suffering. She thought about Michael, about building a life worth living, about Tarek's face when she'd agreed to the trials. She thought about every person who'd ever underestimated her, and she ran faster. When the settlement came into view, the sun was approaching its zenith. Lillian forced her exhausted body into a final sprint, crossing into the central area just as shadows began to shorten toward noon. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, every muscle trembling. But she'd made it. Nantan approached, offering her water. The first trial is complete. Rest now. The second begins tomorrow. Tarek was there immediately, supporting her as she struggled to stand. You're insane, he muttered, but there was pride in his voice. Just stubborn, Lillian managed between gasps. Remember? The second trial came the next morning, and this time Lillian was better prepared for the unexpected. Nantan led her to a small workshop area where various tools and materials were laid out. Leather, bone needles, sinew thread, herbs, clay. Today you will create something useful for the community. You have until sunset. What you make and how you make it is your choice. But it must have value, must demonstrate skill, and must show you understand what we need to survive. This was different from physical endurance. This required thought, creativity, and cultural understanding she didn't fully possess. Lillian studied the materials, her mind racing. What did the settlement need? What could she make that would genuinely prove her worth? She noticed several children playing nearby, their shoes worn nearly through. Winter would come eventually to these mountains, and thin leather soles wouldn't be enough. Decision made, Lillian began working on children's moccasins, using techniques she'd watched Desba employ, but adapting them with her own knowledge of proper fit and durability. She worked steadily through the day, her fingers cramping from the unfamiliar motions, her back aching from hunching over the detailed work. Other women drifted by throughout the day, watching without comment. Lillian ignored them, focusing entirely on making each moccasin as well as she possibly could. By sunset, she'd completed 4 pairs in different sizes, each reinforced at stress points, each lined with soft rabbit fur she'd bartered from another woman in exchange for future help with English lessons. She presented them to Nantan as the sun touched the western peaks. He examined each pair carefully, testing the stitching, checking the fit against children called over for sizing. Finally, he nodded. These are well made. They will keep feet warm and dry. He handed them to waiting mothers, who accepted them with expressions that weren't quite approval, but weren't hostility either. The second trial is complete. That night, one of the women who'd watched Lillian work approached their dwelling. She spoke in halting English, clearly uncomfortable with the language. You make good. My son. She gestured to a boy of about 7. His feet, cold. You make for him? Lillian felt something loosen in her chest. Yes, I'd be honored. The woman nodded, relief evident on her face, and left. Small victories, Tarek said quietly, but they matter. I just want them to see me as a person, not a symbol. You're getting there, one moccasin at a time. The third trial was announced at dawn on the 5th day, and this time Nantan's expression was grave. The final trial is wisdom and courage together. You will spend the night alone in the sacred canyon to the east. You will take no weapon, no food, no water. You will sit in meditation from sunset to sunrise, facing whatever comes, whether it is animal, spirit, or your own fear. He paused. Many of our young warriors have failed this trial. It requires strength of mind as much as body. Lillian's mouth went dry. What if something attacks me? Then you use your wisdom to survive without violence, or you accept your fate. Nantan's voice softened slightly. This is not meant to kill you, Lillian Cross. It is meant to show whether you can face the unknown with the calm strength our people need to survive, whether you can sit with discomfort and fear without running from it. It was, Lillian realized, the perfect test for someone like her, someone who'd spent her life in relative comfort and safety until the frontier had shattered that illusion. When do I begin? Tonight. We will escort you to the canyon at sunset. You will return at dawn, or not at all. The day passed too quickly. Lillian tried to prepare mentally, meditating as Naichi had taught her, controlling her breathing, focusing her thoughts. But underneath the calm she tried to project, terror lurked. Tarek was quieter than usual, his worry evident in the tension of his shoulders and the way he kept finding excuses to touch her, adjusting her hair, holding her hand, pulling her close for brief embraces. I don't like this, he finally admitted as afternoon faded toward evening. Too many things could go wrong. Then trust that I'm strong enough to handle them. It's not about trust, it's about... He stopped, struggling with words. It's about me finally letting someone in and being terrified of losing them. Lillian cupped his face in her hands. You're not going to lose me. Not to this trial, not to Morrison, not to anything. We've come too far for that. Promise me. I promise I'll fight to come back. That's all anyone can promise. At sunset, a small group including Nantan, Naichi, and several elders walked Lillian to the canyon entrance. It was a narrow slash in the rock face, opening into darkness that seemed to swallow light. Remember, Nantan said, face whatever comes with calm. Do not run. Do not fight unless there is no other choice. Sit with your fear until you understand it. Lillian nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped into the canyon. Behind her, she heard them leave, their footsteps fading until silence pressed in from all sides. The canyon was cold despite the day's heat, the stone walls radiating chill as stars emerged overhead. Lillian found a flat rock near the center and sat, cross-legged, forcing her breathing to slow. The first hour was the hardest. Every sound made her jump, rocks settling, wind through crevices, the distant call of a night bird. Her mind conjured threats in every shadow, mountain lions, bears, rattlesnakes, Morrison's men somehow finding this hidden place. But as the hours crawled past and nothing materialized from the darkness, Lillian's fear began to transform into something else. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The wagon train attack, meeting Tarek, choosing to come back for him, killing a man to protect him, riding into the mountains, accepting these trials. Each choice had been terrifying. Each had required her to become someone different from the schoolteacher who'd left Missouri with dreams of California sunshine and fresh starts. That woman was gone. The person sitting in this canyon was harder, stronger, more capable of violence and survival and sacrifice than she'd ever imagined becoming. And somehow, despite everything, she'd found love in the process. Not the soft, comfortable love she'd once imagined, but something forged in fire and blood and shared danger. Something that felt unbreakable precisely because it had been tested so severely. Sometime deep in the night, a mountain lion did appear, its eyes reflecting starlight as it padded into the canyon. Lillian's heart hammered, but she didn't move. She met the creature's gaze steadily, acknowledging it without challenging it, present without threatening. The lion watched her for long minutes, its tail twitching, muscles coiled. Then, apparently deciding she wasn't worth the effort, It turned and disappeared back into the darkness. Lillian exhaled shakily, her hands trembling, but she'd passed the test. She'd faced genuine danger without running or panicking. Dawn came eventually, light creeping down the canyon walls in slow increments. Lillian stood stiffly, every joint protesting the night of stillness, and walked back toward the entrance. The group was waiting, more people than had escorted her in. It seemed half the settlement had gathered to see if she'd survived. Nantan stepped forward. "You have completed the 3 trials. You have proven endurance, skill, and courage. The council has decided you are welcome among us, Lillian Cross. Welcome as family, not merely as guest." The formality of the words contrasted with the weight they carried. Around her, people nodded, and even Ishta's expression had shifted from hostility to something closer to grudging respect. Tarek was there suddenly, pulling her into his arms, and Lillian felt the tension she'd been carrying for days finally release. "Told you," she whispered into his chest. "Not going anywhere." Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. The celebration that followed was modest but genuine. People shared food, told stories, and for the first time Lillian felt truly included in the conversations rather than observed from outside them. As evening approached, Naichi pulled her aside. "The rancher sent word he'll arrive tomorrow with the boy. You should prepare." Joy and nervousness warred in Lillian's chest. "Is he safe? The message didn't say anything was wrong?" Everything went smoothly. Martha and Samuel sent letters explaining the situation, packed his belongings, and the rancher reports the child was brave during the journey. Naichi smiled. "He'll be here by noon tomorrow." That night, Lillian couldn't sleep. She kept imagining Michael's face when he saw her, wondering how much he'd grown in the weeks they'd been apart. Whether he'd be angry she'd left, whether he'd understand why. Tarek found her outside, staring at stars. "You're worried." "He's 5. He's been through trauma. I abandoned him with strangers to chase after you into the wilderness. What if he can't forgive me?" "Children are more resilient than adults. And from what you've told me, that boy loves you. Love doesn't disappear just because someone makes a hard choice." Speaking from experience? Tarek pulled her close. "Learning from experience. I spent 15 years believing love was weakness, and you proved me catastrophically wrong. If I can learn that, Michael can learn that sometimes the people we love have to leave temporarily to build something worth coming back to." The next morning, Lillian was awake before dawn, pacing nervously, checking and rechecking the small area she'd prepared for Michael, a sleeping mat next to hers, a small carved horse Tarek had made, some colored stones she'd found that she thought he might like. When the rancher's wagon appeared on the eastern path shortly after midday, Lillian's heart nearly stopped. And then she saw him, Michael, small and serious, sitting beside the rancher with his belongings in a bundle beside him. She ran. Michael saw her and his face transformed, all the seriousness melting into pure joy. He jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped and ran toward her on legs that had grown longer in their weeks apart. They collided in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. "Miss Lily, I missed you so much. Martha said you had to go somewhere important, but you'd come back, and you did. You came back." Lillian held him so tight she was probably hurting him, but she couldn't let go. "I'm sorry I left. I'm so sorry. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." "Promise?" "Promise." Michael pulled back slightly, looking around at the settlement with wide eyes. "Is this where we live now?" Martha said it was in the mountains with nice people who'd take care of us. "Yes, these are the Chiricahua Apache. They've welcomed us into their home." "Cool." Michael's resilience was staggering. "Can I see? Are there animals? Can I learn to ride a horse?" Tarek approached slowly, giving Michael space to notice him. When the boy's eyes landed on the warrior, his face lit up even more. "The lizard man! You're the lizard man who helped us." Tarek actually laughed. "I've been called worse things. Yes, I'm the one who showed you the desert spiny." "Are there lizards here too? Can you show me?" "Tomorrow. Today you should rest and get settled." The rancher handed down Michael's belongings along with letters from Martha and Samuel. He accepted payment and Lillian's profound thanks, then departed with promises to carry messages back about their safe arrival. That evening, the settlement held a gathering to welcome Michael. Children immediately adopted him into their games despite the language barrier, and Lillian watched with tears in her eyes as he chased them around the central area, laughing with the pure joy only children seemed capable of after trauma. "He's resilient," Desba commented, standing beside Lillian. "Strong spirit. He'll do well here." "I hope so. He's already lost so much." "Haven't we all?" Desba gestured to the people around them. "This entire settlement is built by survivors, by people who refused to accept that loss was the end of their story. Your nephew will fit right in." Over the following weeks, the settlement developed new rhythms that included both Lillian and Michael. She taught English to those who wanted to learn, helped with medical care using knowledge from her teaching days, and continued making clothing for children who needed it. Michael absorbed Apache words at the speed only children could manage, learned to help with daily tasks, and became a fixture in the group of children who played by the stream. And through it all, Lillian and Tarek built something that looked increasingly like a life. They were working together to build a separate dwelling, a home of their own, when Nietzsche arrived one morning with urgent news. Morrison's cavalry has been withdrawn. The territorial governor investigated his operations and found evidence of corruption, murder of his own men, falsified reports. Nietzsche's expression was triumphant. "He's been arrested. The bounty on Tarek is lifted." The news was so unexpected that Lillian actually dropped the adobe brick she'd been carrying. "What?" One of Morrison's own mercenaries turned on him, provided evidence in exchange for immunity. The whole operation collapsed. Nietzsche looked at Tarek. "You're free. The cavalry isn't hunting you anymore." Tarek stood very still, as if afraid that moving might shatter this impossible reality. "Free. You could leave the mountains if you wanted, go to the cities, live openly, stop hiding." But Tarek's eyes found Lillian, then Michael playing nearby, then the half-built home they'd been constructing together. "Why would I leave?" he said quietly. "Everything I need is here." The dwelling was completed 3 weeks later. It was modest but sturdy, with space for sleeping, cooking, and living. Michael claimed a corner for himself, decorating it with stones and feathers he'd collected. The night they moved in, after Michael had fallen asleep, Lillian and Tarek sat outside watching stars emerge over the mountain peaks. "Do you ever regret it?" Tarek asked. "Giving up the life you planned? California, teaching in a real school, safety?" Lillian considered this seriously. "I regret the violence. I regret the people we lost. But this?" She gestured to their home, to the settlement beyond, to the life they'd built from impossible circumstances. "No, I don't regret this. Even though it's harder than anything you imagined. Especially because it's harder. Easy things don't teach you who you really are." She turned to face him. "I thought I wanted comfort and predictability, but what I actually needed was to become someone strong enough to build something real, even when the world made it nearly impossible." Tarek pulled her close. "I spent 15 years convinced that attachment was death, that love was weakness, that the only way to survive was alone. And now? Now I know that survival without connection isn't really living, it's just existing, waiting for death." He kissed her forehead. "You taught me the difference. You and that stubborn refusal to let me push you away. Someone had to be stubborn. You certainly weren't going to make it easy." "No, I wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Marry me." Lillian pulled back to look at him. "What?" "Marry me. In whatever tradition you want. Apache, settler, something we make up ourselves. I don't care about the form. I just want everyone to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and that we chose this despite everything the world threw at us." Tears pricked Lillian's eyes. "Yes. Obviously, yes." They were married a month later in a ceremony that blended traditions. Apache customs provided by Nantan and Nietzsche, settler elements Lillian remembered from Missouri, and promises they wrote themselves about facing the future together regardless of what it brought. Michael served as a witness, beaming with pride in new clothes Desba had made for the occasion. The entire settlement attended, and even Ishta offered grudging congratulations afterward. As seasons turned and years passed, the settlement thrived in its hidden valley. Children grew, new families formed, and the outside world slowly forgot that this pocket of free Apache existed in the mountains. Lillian never returned to Missouri or made it to California. The life she'd imagined, teaching in a proper schoolroom, living in a comfortable house, pursuing the conventional dreams of a young woman from the East, dissolved completely. Instead, she became something she'd never anticipated, a bridge between worlds, a healer and teacher in a community that needed both. A mother to Michael, and eventually to her own children with Tarek, a woman who'd proven that strength came in forms the world rarely acknowledged. Tarek transformed too, though more subtly. The hardness that had defined him for 15 years softened around the edges without disappearing entirely. He remained a warrior when needed, a protector when threats arose, but he also became a father who taught children to track animals and read the weather, a husband who built homes and tended gardens, a man who'd learned that attachment wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made survival worthwhile. Michael grew into a young man who moved between cultures with the ease of those who'd never known rigid boundaries. He spoke English and Apache with equal fluency, understood both worlds without being limited by either, and eventually became a leader in the settlement, using his unique perspective to navigate the inevitable encounters with the changing world outside. On a spring evening 20 years after that first desperate encounter near a burning wagon train, Lillian sat outside the home she and Tarek had built, expanded and filled with life. Her hair was graying now, lines carved around her eyes from years of mountain sun and laughter. Tarek emerged from the dwelling, moving slower than he once had, but still with that essential grace. He sat beside her, taking her hand with the casual intimacy of decades shared. "Thinking about the past?" he asked. "About the wagon train, about being terrified and alone with a child, thinking we'd die in the desert. If you could go back and tell that woman what was coming, what would you say?" Lillian considered this. "I'd tell her it's going to be harder than anything she can imagine, that she'll have to become someone completely different to survive, that she'll kill and bleed and face death more times than she can count." "That's encouraging." "I'm not finished." Lillian squeezed his hand. "I'd tell her that she'll also discover she's stronger than she ever knew, that she'll find love in the last place she'd expect it, that she'll build a family and a life that matters more than any comfortable dream she left behind, and that every impossible choice, every terrifying moment, every sacrifice will be worth it." Would she believe you? Probably not, but that's fine. Some things have to be lived to be understood. In the distance, their grandchildren played near the stream, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Michael's voice called out, teaching them the same lessons about desert creatures that Tarek had once taught him. The world beyond the mountains continued its relentless change, territories becoming states, reservations expanding and contracting, endless cycles of conflict and uneasy peace. But in this hidden valley, life continued with the rhythm of people who'd chosen survival on their own terms, who'd refused to let the world's cruelty determine their fate. Lillian had come to the frontier seeking a fresh start. What she'd found instead was transformation, of herself, of the people around her, of what it meant to build something lasting from the broken pieces of impossible circumstances. She'd lost much along the way, but what she'd gained, this life, this family, this love forged in fire and blood, and stubborn determination, was worth every sacrifice. "No regrets?" Tarek asked, echoing their conversation from decades ago. Lillian looked at the settlement they'd helped build, at the children playing in safety, at the man beside her who'd learned to let love in despite every instinct screaming against it. "Not a single one," she said, and as stars emerged overhead like promises kept, Lillian Cross, once a schoolteacher from Missouri, now a woman forged by the frontier and refined by love, knew with absolute certainty that she'd finally found the place where she belonged. Not despite the hardship and danger and impossible odds, but because of them. Because sometimes the best lives weren't the ones you planned. They were the ones you fought for, bled for, and built with your own hands alongside someone who'd become worth every risk. Sometimes survival wasn't about staying safe, it was about finding something, someone, worth surviving for. And that made all the difference.